Every time Rick Harrison hit the jackpot. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Mind Hub. Rick Harrison has been buying and selling items for a long time now. He's definitely one hell of a pawn star at this point in his career, and has plenty of wins under his belt. He has obviously had some bad buys during his time running the gold and silver pawn shop, but he's definitely had more wins than losses. Today, we're going to cover every time Rick Harrison hit the jackpot during his time on Pawn Stars, highlighting some of the biggest wins. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mind Hub. Also, comment Jackpot, and we'll give a lucky winner a shout out in the next video. 10. 1962 Lincoln Continental.
Take a good look at this baby. All this chrome, all this trim. Look at that interior.
A 62 Lincoln Continental is a pretty slick-looking car, and they're definitely prized by the right collectors. A seller ended up hooking Rick up in a big way without actually realizing it when he showed up to the shop to see if Rick was willing to buy one off of him. Rick was definitely excited about this big opportunity, especially when he heard the price the seller was looking to get the car to go for. He was only asking for $14,000, which would have been a steal when you consider the fact that these cars sell for at least double that amount. The Lincoln Continental in question looked pretty mint as far as we're concerned, and the only issue it had was the interior needed a bit of touching up. Rick really hammered this point home in order to get the seller to knock off $4,500 off his asking price, picking the car up for only $9,500. That price worked out great for Rick because the car only sold for $10,000 brand new back in the day, meaning that Rick picked it up for a steal. It's a ridiculously collectible car these days, and being able to get one for less than $20,000 that's still in good condition is a ridiculously hard feat to pull off. It's clear that the seller had no real clue what he had on his hands, and Rick took advantage of that, making them doubt the worth of their prized possession. We feel that we should point out that Rick did have to sink something like $10,000 into restoring the vehicle to its former glory, but that's minuscule when you consider that Rick managed to make over $35,000 on his purchase when it was finally ready to be put up for auction. 9. Yatsutsugu Samurai Sword.
I know that I don't know enough to buy them without calling somebody.
You just bought those?
Yes, I did.
When a lawyer showed up to the shop one day, he had an interesting item that he had received as collateral for a bill that he ended up not getting paid for. That meant that he was a proud owner of a random sword that he really wasn't interested in holding on to going forward. Instead of letting it go to waste, he decided to see if Rick was down to buy the sword off of him. Rick started negotiations by offering the guy $800 for the sword, which is next to nothing, even when it comes to knockoff samurai swords. This sword, however, was the real deal and dated back to the 15th century, making it a very impressive find indeed. The seller knew that an $800 price tag was far too low for him to take seriously, asking Rick to sweeten the deal a little bit. Rick wasn't ready to pay much more than that for the weapon though, and the two eventually decided that $1,500 was fair for both of them. That would have been all well and good if the deal was, in fact, fair to the seller. It wasn't. As it turns out, the sword has been confirmed to have been worth around $5,000 in the condition it was in when it was first brought into the shop. Rick tossed an additional $3,000 or so to restore the blade, increasing its value to somewhere around $15,000 as far as most collectors are concerned. So Rick paid less than $4,000 for a sword that was initially worth at least $5,000, but ended up bringing around 3 times that amount when Rick was done touching it up. 8. Stolen coins.
We're talking $500-600. With a C, we're talking a whole lot more.
When a woman brought in an antique coin collection, telling Rick that she was interested in selling it all, she didn't mind settling for less than what the collection was worth, and that's probably because the collection wasn't hers. She had stolen it from her uncle when she decided that she wasn't above stooping so low to make a quick buck. The collection was sold over the course of 3 separate trips that earned her an easy $12,000. Fortunately for her uncle, he noticed the theft and reported it to the police. It didn't take much work for them to discover that his niece had stolen his collection. When they hauled her in to face the music, she spilled the beans, revealing that she had sold the entire collection piece by piece at the gold and silver pawn shop. When police arrived to collect the haul and return it to its rightful owner, they found out that the shop had actually gone and melted down all of the coins they had received. The haul ended up being worth an estimated $50,000 at the very least, but the team at the shop hadn't bothered to check its true value, instead opting to melt it all down at once in order to flip it quickly. They didn't make as much money on the stolen gold coins as they could have, but they still made off like bandits by earning far more than the $12,000 they paid the thief. They weren't required to pay the owner the estimated value of his coin collection, and they only had to pay back the $12,000 they originally paid for it. Furthermore, they would have had to give all the coins back if they still had them, but since they melted them all and sold the gold, they ended up getting lucky at the real owner's expense. 7. Colt 45 Peacemaker.
Colt Revolver.
This is cool. Do you know much about it?
I know it's an old piece. I want to say 1800s.
A seller of a vintage revolver that was originally built in the 1800s screwed himself over a little bit when he accidentally admitted that he had only paid $25 to pick up the weapon. Rick and the team were all happy to take advantage of his naivety, choosing to lowball the guy instead of working to find a reasonable price that worked for everyone involved in the deal. The revolver had a few dents and dings, but that's to be expected from a fully working weapon from way back when. Rick didn't totally take the guy for a ride and offered him $3,000 in return for the rare revolver. The guy should have asked to have an expert come in and look at the weapon, however, and gotten a second opinion, but he happily took the $3K and called it a win. That being the case, he would have been really surprised if he had done minimal research ahead of walking into the shop, because the lowest amount that a revolver like that currently sells for is $5,000. The real kicker is that with only a teeny tiny amount of money spent to restore the weapon, it's clear that he could have easily made upwards of $40,000 off of it, instead of the relatively measly $3,000 that Rick paid to take it off his hands. Rick most likely went that route and probably made a minor killing selling the restored gun at auction. 6. Chris Craft Boat. Dropping only $16,500 on a boat, Rick ended up doing very well for himself. The seller originally started negotiations hoping to get no less than $20,000, but managed to let himself get talked down to $3,500 less than that. He could have made a lot more money than $16,500 if he had opted to take care of restoring the boat and selling it at auction himself, but obviously decided it would be easier to just sell it to the gold and silver pawn shop instead. Rick ended up being really pleased with his purchase because he made double what he bought the boat for after he had touched it up. The Chris Craft sold at auction for $30,000, and we bet that the original seller is a little upset at this point that he didn't put more work into finding out what it was really worth. He could have easily made an extra $10,000 more than what he walked away with, seeing as how repairs ended up being minimal. Rick only paid a few thousand to get it back in working order and definitely did very well for himself when all said and done. 5. Edward Curtis Photogravers. Before selfies and even photographs were a thing, photogravers were all the rage. When photography was in its infancy, these photogravers blended a copper plate with gelatin to develop the images. They're amazingly hard to find nowadays, especially in good condition. Their rarity just keeps increasing, and at this point, they're worth a stupid amount of money as far as collectors are concerned. Rick had no idea what he was doing when he saw the photogravers and had no clue who Edward Curtis was at the time. For those of you who still don't know who he is, Curtis was an American photographer who also dabbled in photogravers from time to time. Those who do know him will no doubt know that his work is worth a pretty penny these days. The seller also had no idea how much the set of photogravers was worth, eventually letting Rick have them for only $50. Rick then had an expert look them over and was surprised to learn that the entire set he had just spent next to nothing on were actually worth over $20,000. Rick didn't really screw the seller over, since he was oblivious to their value, but those sorts of gains are hard to come by without somebody ending up seriously disappointed. We're sure the seller would have been gutted if they knew the true value of their photograver set, and we hope for their sake that they never learned just how much they screwed up. 4. Polish Order of the White Eagle Medallion.
What do you mean not technically Polish?
It's Russian. 1795, Poland was partitioned into 3 parts.
When a guy happened by a yard sale, an interesting medallion caught his eye, prompting him to buy it without knowing much about it. He figured it would be a solid conversation piece at the very least, but ended up deciding to sell it to Rick in order to make a quick buck. He had only paid 75 cents for the medallion and was happy to take an offer that seemed reasonable. Rick wasn't able to tell him much about the piece, but knew that it had at least some value to back it up, offering the guy $6,000 for it. The seller happily took Rick's money and handed over his medallion, content with having made $6K without much effort. Rick then called in an expert to evaluate the piece and was blown away when he learned that it was a rare Polish artifact that dated all the way back to the 16th century. He was even more surprised when he was told that he'd be able to easily get $30,000 for the piece. He did just that, flipping a $6,000 purchase for 5 times more than he paid for it. At least the seller wasn't the chump who let it go for 75 cents. Although we're still sure that he still would have been floored if he had known just how much the medallion was actually worth before selling it to Rick for so little. 3. 2001 Super Bowl ring.
Ring from the 2001 Patriots versus Rams. One of the players came in here a few years ago, and I bought it off him.
It isn't every day that a pawn shop owner has the chance to scoop up a legitimate Super Bowl ring, and Rick pounced on the opportunity to nab one for himself when a seller showed up looking to sell one. They're worth a silly amount of money to most collectors, and demand is amazingly high, especially with so few of them floating around. Brock Williams, who didn't play in the 2001 Super Bowl, but was a member of the winning team, the Patriots at the time, opted to give the ring up to Rick and the team in exchange for a small amount of cash, intending on paying Rick back at a later date. Rick won the lottery, however, when when Williams never returned to claim the ring, effectively making it Rick's to do whatever he wanted with it. Rick still has the ring and doesn't seem like he's ready to sell it yet, but we're sure that he can make a small fortune off of it if he ever decided to let it go. It's currently one of the most prized possessions, and he'll happily brag about owning one to anybody who will listen to the story about how he managed to get his hands on it. 2. Vic Flick, 1961 Fender Stratocaster. This guitar was brought in by none other than Vic Flick himself. Flick was the man behind the James Bond theme song, among having achieved plenty of other accomplishments throughout his career. It was a guitar that he had used during his career, and he was looking to make some money off of it since he didn't need it anymore. The Stratocaster name is a big one in rock and roll history, and it's one of Fender's most well-known guitars of all time, which is saying quite a lot. It seems that Flick also recorded the James Bond theme song while using the exact same guitar that he brought into the shop. Rick paid much less than the $50,000 that the guitar was worth at the time, and we're sure that it's only gone up in value since then. We don't know for sure what Rick did with the guitar once he bought it off of Flick, but we're willing to bet that he eventually sold it and that he made a tidy profit off of it. 1. Book of Mormon.
The Book of Mormon.
Is it the play or the book?
It's definitely the book. It's even harder to get this than tickets to the play.
One of the original copies of the Book of Mormon, an 1842 5th edition version, happened to be brought into the shop one day when Rick was hanging out at the counter. The seller knew what he had on his hands and also knew that the book was one of the last copies to be personally published by the founder of the religion, Joseph Smith. Rick brought in an expert to have a look and learned that it was, in fact, totally genuine. Additionally, he learned that the book was worth around $40,000. He managed to talk the seller down to a mere $24,000, which is crazy considering that the seller had also heard its estimated worth. If we had something that valuable, we wouldn't let it go for just over half of what it was worth at auction. But the seller seemed happy with the deal.